Good morning, my brothers and sisters in Christ. We have a small men's group that meets here at St. Monica Parish. We meet in the rectory meeting room at 7:30 on Saturday mornings. And any men who are here, if you've never joined us, please know you're invited and welcome. And what we've been doing for the past few months is we read the reading that's going to come up for Mass this weekend. And then together we talk about it and figure it out and figure out ways to apply it to our lives and pray for each other. Well, this week we pondered and prayed with the gospel I just proclaimed to you. And we really focused on this gospel being about, this parable being about how important it is that we use our money, our wealth, our resources properly and wisely and prudently. And that is good and true. That is certainly the meaning of the parable, and you can see that in today's readings. It's also what the church gives us in the first reading from Amos and in our responsorial psalm. And I thought when I wrote my homily yesterday, it would flow out of what we talked about yesterday morning, but it didn't. There's another level to this that I came across when I was doing some further study, which I also believe is good and true. So with apologies to the men's group who helped me out yesterday, I'm going a different direction. So this parable is known as the parable of the unjust steward. And it is found in Luke chapter 16. Immediately before Luke 16, obviously, is Luke 15. And in Luke 15, there's three things. There are three parables that Jesus tells back to back to back. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son. We also call that one the parable of the prodigal son. And as soon in the Bible, in the Gospel of Luke, as you read the last verse of the parable of the prodigal son, no break, no extra verses, Jesus starts immediately with the parable we heard today, the parable of the unjust steward. And so if you read them back to back, like they are in the text, it jumps out at you that there's a lot of things in common in those two parables. In both of them, you have a person who should know better and who should act differently, who goes astray and squanders the resources of someone else. Both of those parables deal with broken trust and all the problems that arise from that. And what I'd like to reflect on today, in both parables, the one who is wayward, the one who's gone astray, reaches a particular moment of truth. And in that moment, he realizes his only hope is to throw himself back on the mercy of the one whose resources he has squandered. And so with that context and those similarities, let's just quickly walk through this parable. The steward is reported, it says he was reported to the master for squandering his property. Now, Jesus doesn't mention anything in this parable about the master doing an investigation. So this report came from people that the master trusted. Almost certainly then the master's friends, those who are in debt to him. And it also tells us that he's a respected man, because if they didn't care, they never would have come to him with this report. They cared about his property and his business. And when the master confronts the servant, notice how he shows him mercy multiple times. Firstly, he simply asks, "What is this I hear about you?" He doesn't accuse him of anything. In that moment of mercy, he provides the steward the opportunity to admit what he's done wrong, to apologize, to seek forgiveness. The steward doesn't do any of those things. And so I would submit to you, in mercy, he fires him. Well, why would I say that's in mercy? Because legally, at that time, in that place, in that culture, he had the right to do one of two things. He could have thrown that servant, that steward, into jail, or he could have taken that servant and his entire family and sold them into slavery to repay any of the squandering that had been done. Instead, he fires him, but then he tells him to go and get the books. I want to see the accounts. And it's at this moment in the parable, when we who are listening to it or reading it, we know something that the master's friends, those in debt to him, do not. We know that he's been fired. They do not. And so maybe he's got, in this parable, an hour or so, and in that hour, he realizes, look, I am not weak enough. I'm not able to beg for a living. No one will give me money. I'm not strong enough to dig ditches or do manual labor. The only thing I know how to do is be a steward. And if I lose this job, and then this becomes known in what I've done, I'll never have another job. And so he comes up with this shrewd, clever plan. He quickly calls his master's friends, those who the master has loaned things to. And notice he calls them not together, but individually, one by one. And as each of them comes into the room, he significantly reduces the debt that they owe. Notice that he also has them write those promissory notes out in their own handwriting. So the master knows this didn't just come from him, this was something they both worked on together. Now put yourself in the place of someone who's called into that room. The steward says, "What do you owe my master?" "I owe him this much." He says, "Write a promissory note for this much." He would be thinking, well, the master must have authorized this. The master is a merciful man. The master is kind and generous. The master is forgiving a good portion of my debt. All praise to the master. So again, remember, the steward knows he's been fired. The master knows he's been fired, but those whose debts are being forgiven or reduced do not. Now, anytime you read one of Jesus' parables, you always are going to get to the point where you go, well, what's next? What happened? Because frequently Jesus leaves out the details in the parable that we really want to know. Like, how did this all work out? And so there's this little space in the parable where he wants us to figure out what would have happened next. Clearly, the ex-steward is going to take those books back to the master, turn them in, and he's going to leave. We realize that must happen. But what I want you to imagine is what's happening in the streets of that town when the ex-steward walks out of the master's house. There must be celebration and feasting and honoring the master's name. Because again, remember, everybody in town believes it's the master who's been generous, not the steward who's been dishonest. So at this point, the master has to make a choice. And there's really only two choices he has. The first choice is to walk out in the streets and go, "Hey, I had fired that guy. Everything he did was illegal. You still owe me the full amount of money." Well, what happens then? The celebration stops. People's opinion of him change. Or he can remain quiet, eat the cost of what his ex-steward has done, and continue to enjoy his reputation as a merciful and generous man. Now, I submit to you, when you read or hear this parable, that's exactly what the steward was counting on. He was counting on the fact that because his master is merciful and generous, he would choose this second option. And that's why the master commends him, not for his dishonesty, but for his prudence, for his wisdom, for his choice that he made. And so this ex-steward is now almost certainly going to get a job being a steward somewhere else from someone in this town. Even if this whole story later becomes known about how this happened, just like the master, they too are going to be amazed at this guy's intelligence, his daring, his shrewdness, his ingenuity. He's certainly going to find employment with someone who recognizes his genius and his gifts, but I'm sure we'll have to watch him closely. So what does that mean for us? Well, certainly on one level, I think on the surface level, this parable does teach us to be prudent with all the resources God has entrusted with us. And that's what we talked about a lot at men's group yesterday. God has gifted us with incredible resources, especially here in the United States of America. And we need to use those gifts, our money, our resources wisely. And in the context of St. Luke's gospel, Jesus is talking throughout this whole section about serving the poor, helping out those who are less fortunate, not holding and grasping it for ourselves, but pouring it out as well. But on another level, like the parable of the prodigal son, I think this also reveals how good and merciful and wonderful God the Father truly is. For like the son and the steward, one of whom, the prodigal son, remember the story, he was at the point where he recognized the mistakes he had made and the consequences of them. He was feeding pods to pigs. He had already experienced the consequences. This guy, the steward, had not yet experienced them, but he was anticipating them. What am I going to do for work? How am I going to survive? In both those cases, the son and the steward squander the possessions which they were entrusted, but they discover that for healing, for salvation, for restoration, it cannot come from what they've done. It cannot come from their own worthiness. They need to cast themselves completely back upon the mercy of the one whose property they squandered. What has God given to us? How many good things has he shared with us of which we are called to be stewards? How often have we squandered them, not used them in the proper way? We are called to be his stewards of these gifts in this world. And when we realize what we've done, when we realize either the consequences we've already facing or those that are coming up upon us, our only choice is to throw ourselves back, as they did, on the mercy of the Father. Because remember, the ex-steward's entire plan succeeds only because he knows how merciful the Father is. Do you comprehend how merciful God is for you? How much he loves you? How much he desires to be in relationship with you? How much he desires to pour out his generous love upon you with no end, with no bounds? Because wherever we are, we can't save ourselves. Not by our merit, but by his mercy. Not by our perfection, but by his forgiveness. Not by our strength, but by his love. May all of us be wise enough to know, like the prodigal son and the unjust steward, that our only hope is to cast ourselves completely upon the mercy of the Heavenly Father. And may our reception of that mercy, which he desires to give to us, lead us not to condemnation, but to conversion. Not to judgment, but to joy. May God bless you all.